Welcome back. We're on chapter 4 of the Inscape, the deep dive into my book with my special guest, Taya Nelson and daughter, who co-collaborated this entire book with me. So it's so fun to get to talk to you about this. Chapter 4 is probably one of, I'm going to say this about every one of them, but it is probably one of my favorite chapters. And it makes me laugh. It really does, because the role of the observer was a place where I had believed I had arrived, I had reached enlightenment, and my journey was done. And the reason I laugh is because it was like literally just beginning. And so as we look at the meditation, I think it's a really fun, it's short in chapter 4, and it's really just this idea of I have reached the top of the mountain. Mm-hmm. And that's how it felt for me. Like I had just really, I had done the work. I was done. It really felt like this was a resting place for me. I'd reached the top of the mountain and again, had no idea that I had really just started the journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So as we move into the observer, I think what happened for me, and the part that I think sticks out the most for me about this is, one, what is the observer? And it took me, I would probably say, I don't know, maybe 40 books and 5 years to really feel like I had mastered this concept. And that was that I was more than my thoughts. I was more than my emotions. I had already been raised religiously. I knew I was a spiritual being, but I didn't know how to quite apply that to my everyday life. And it started with really asking myself the question of, are there any coincidences in life? And as I started to really look at my life and the day-to-day beliefs inside of my head, and to listen to the thoughts and the programming that I had in my head, becoming the observer, or at least being able to step back and just observe myself to where I could start to have conscious conversations with myself, really felt amazing. It really felt like this sanctuary of what I had believed I had reached, like unconditional love at this point, because as long as I could observe, I knew that no matter what I was thinking, feeling, or experiencing, somehow I was like exempt from that. Mm-hmm. Because I could just identify myself as something else. And I think that was the funny part and a little bit of the trick that my ego played with me on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really common destination for people that seek to, any kind of higher way of thinking, higher consciousness. I think the observer is what they would think of as an arrival. Yeah. Until you realize, like, obviously it takes years of practice, but it's attainable in a sense, in a relatively, reasonable amount of time. And people don't realize that it's the stepping stone on this, grander journey. And I think that's what we set it up as really well in the book, which is why I think we don't really refer to it as any kind of beginner self-help book, though it's neither of those things, because to do so would imply that it would be mostly about teaching someone to observe, because that's really one of the first steps. Yeah. And I think this chapter is really cool in that it assumes the reader's somewhat familiar with that sense of connection to this ground of observation, of awareness, and kind of expands on that, which I think for me, in reading all the books that I did, which, many similar to yours, and that was always a missing piece, is the what comes after that, and how do I elevate beyond that point, and more than that, how do you ground yourself from that point, and where's the duality and the balance in that? And I think that's what this chapter starts as a conversation really interestingly.
I agree. And I'm gonna spark something that again is pretty intimate and behind the scenes between us, and see where this goes. I'm gonna risk a little bit here. I remember for quite some time, even you and I having conversations about this. And I don't know if you remember the resistance in myself, even in again, feeling like this was the destination. This was the time. And even as we talked about, possibly, doing this book and really looking at, what was my message and what did I want to write, and thinking beyond the observer was actually really difficult for me. And I remember, slight conversations, not in full detail, and maybe you will, but just about that, there was almost an irritation that would come out in you about this, right? Like, there's so much more to life than just observing it. And I honestly don't think that without your reflection, I probably wouldn't have, moved much past that, because there was this inner knowing within yourself about this accountability, and really what did that mean for you, and does that spark anything in you as I say that, as we look at some of the conversations even you and I had about that, and what that meant for you as I felt like I had arrived on this journey, and you having this inner knowing that wasn't true.
Yeah, I think it comes down to when you're in a place of observation, there's a natural sense of disconnect, I think. And people don't quite factor that into account when you realize connection is the ultimate goal. I think a lot of people hear connection, they think connection to another person or even connection to yourself, and neither are fully accurate for what we're going for here, because the inscape is supposed to represent this inner landscape that mirrors the outer world in a way that connects you to all things, and
Yes.
there's no limits, no boundaries. And people like that would be an ultimate goal, an ultimate reality, if you will. And the observation doesn't actually get you there. It just it is awareness, but it's not connection.
Correct.
And it kind of felt like sitting on the sidelines of your own life, and that's what it is. That's the idea. And there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of safety in that. But there's not a lot of freedom in it, because it keeps you stuck in one position, and it keeps you in a sort of reactive approach. And I think people talk about, like, it's easy to get into the observer role and buy into ideas of, fate and destiny, and things are going to come, and I'm going to be aware of them, and as they do, I'll interact with them. And that is a technically, I think, more elevated way of going about life than just being unaware at all and being reactive in that sense. And so it is an elevated point of view, hence why in the meditation we use the imagery of a cliff, or, like you're saying, top of the mountain. Like, it does give you that perspective, and that does feel powerful. And it is, I think, people get there, and it's a bit intoxicating in the sense that you don't get that unless you are there, and if you've never felt that before, it feels like such an arrival.
Yeah, it's true.
But really, it's for the purposes of, from what I've observed and experienced personally, it feels always like it's for the purposes of gathering information and tools before taking them back into your own life. Because if we just stay on the cliff the whole time, you're not actually accountable for what's happening in your life. You're not, things are coming and things are going, and you're observing and gathering, input, but there's no actual integration of those things, and thus you're not actually doing anything. There's not a return and expression, which is the phrasing we use in the book, because people often think there's been a distorted sense of that, I think, in this community in a lot of ways, because you don't want to say that you're defined by the things that you do or anything other than this sense of being. But at the same time, we live in a very physical world, and there is a duality to that. And if you ignore that duality, then there is a lack of integrity and accountability to the life that you're living, and the way that is influencing, this outer world. And I think a big problem with the observer mentality is how easy it is to get stuck there.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think your point, and this is something that, like you say, I think we're all passionate about, whether we're conscious of it or not, and that is the connection part of that. And I think to go back to even you and I's relationship, this was a big part of my fall, was the fact that I had believed at this point in my life that I had arrived somewhere so high on this, cliff and mountaintop. And you're right, there was a sense of safety to that, and it wasn't until I realized that, until I had to witness my own story and bring it back into myself, that I had to experience the vulnerability. And that's where the real bravery came in, because, again, I mean, observing, yes, felt like there was a lot of freedom to that. But I got stuck there. And not only did I get stuck there, I think that I think that there was a cost for staying there so long. There was a cost in the ground level connection that I had, to my own story, to what I was creating, inside and outside, what was already inside of me, and what was showing up outside of me as well. So yeah, going into the witness was, I was stuck on chapter 4 for a long time, and there's a lot more chapters to go. And
Mm-hmm.
so, don't miss chapter 5, the witness, because this is where, um, I think this is where even more of diving deep into myself and more authenticity and transparency. And to your point, this is where connection really starts. As painful as it is, this is where it starts. So come back for chapter 5, going into the witness.